All right. Welcome, everybody. We are pleased to bring you another free 90-minute webinar today from Desert Waters Correctional Outreach entitled No Real Prison Reform Without Staff Wellness. I'm Justin Stevens, Desert Waters Chief Operating Officer and Master Instructor. Desert Waters is a nonprofit established in Colorado 22 years ago. Our mission is to improve the well being of corrections and other public safety professionals through training, consulting, and other essential resources to foster resilience, mental health, and overall wellness in these challenging professions. Please visit us at desertwaters.com to learn more about what we do. And if you like these free webinars, please take a moment, like us on Facebook or on LinkedIn. Now to today's presenters. We have Dr. Katerina Spinaris as Desert Waters Executive Director and Founder, and a licensed professional counselor. Her professional experience includes developing wellness curriculum for correctional staff and their family members, training thousands of staff, treating correctional staff and their family members, conducting research on staff wellness, and consulting regarding the building of staff wellness programs. She originated the term corrections fatigue, and one of the courses she authored, From Corrections Fatigue to Fulfillment, CF2F, received the 2016 Commercial Product Award of Excellence by the International Association of Corrections Training Personnel. She recently helped develop Desert Water's unique safety net accreditation program for correctional staff wellness and has authored and co authored 4 books on correctional staff wellness. Dr. Joe Zano is a clinical psychologist with a passion for the wellness for the wellness of all first responders. He retired from the Federal Bureau of Prisons in 2024 after 22 years of service and now serves as the wellness advisor and master instructor at Desert Waters Correctional Outreach. Joe's experience in the BOP spans all security levels, and he has held numerous positions there, including Deputy Chief Psychologist and Administrator of the Civil Commitment and Treatment Program for Sexually Dangerous Persons. He also served as a member of the Federal Correctional Complex in Florence, Colorado, Disturbance Control Team for nearly a decade. Joe has firsthand knowledge of the effects of repeated exposure to direct and indirect trauma, as well as other chronic stressors unique to the correctional workers and first responders. Joe believes establishment of a healthy work culture and environment through a focus on wellness breeds not only trauma and stress resilience, but a safer, more efficient, and more effective workforce. So, with that introduction, let me turn it over to Dr. Katerina Spinaris.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. It really moves me to see so many people showing up for this topic because really this is the heart of corrections, why the whole mission is happening. And we entitled this message today, No Real Prison Reform Without Staff Wellness. So prison reform is not a new thing for that we have come up with, and we very humbly approach it because it's a very complex issue and it's a very convoluted, challenging issue to address. And I looked up some information, and to my amazement, efforts in the United States towards prison reform started in 1787. 1787, with the founding of a what we would call today probably a nonprofit. It was the founding of an organization called the Philadelphia Society. Listen to that title, the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons. And I'm thinking, man, we could set up an organization today called the Organization for Alleviating the Miseries of Prisons. And so this is what today's about. So we humbly approach this topic because it is so complex, and we're not going to pretend that we're going to have all the answers. We're going to focus on one component that we believe very strongly, both Joe and I believe extremely strongly, and the rest of the people on our team, that without staff wellness, you cannot get to real prison reform. So we're going to focus on the staff wellness component of a really big, complex picture. And we'll take questions about it and ideas at the end or all along as we go all along the whole presentation. And again, remember the focus is on staff wellness as a contributor and in an ideal world, also an outcome of prison reform. the two go back and forth like a feedback loop, back and forth. So our good friend Greg Morton, who's been with us for over 10 years, and he has worked in corrections for like 35 years. He has a quote that I really love. And he's addressing what I call a non-negotiable reality. And a lot of times people try to kind of ignore it, but it's true. He's saying that the staff wellness is not the agency's mission, but it's an indispensable component for the fulfillment of the agency's mission. You cannot have fulfillment of the agency's mission, including safety and rehabilitation, without staff being well. And obviously, I mean, it seems self-evident, but for the longest time, it's been like ignored. It's like in the blind spot that people just expected, I guess, staff to perform no matter what kind of shape they're in, to perform and deliver. And and we talked about starting efforts starting in 1787, and they have continued throughout. Look at the history. You can look it up in Wikipedia, anywhere, all over the place. Every century had its attempts for reform of prisons. And in the 1970s, 80s, there have been a lot more there's been a more modern push. Frances Cheek and her collaborator Miller produced a very seminal study about the stress of corrections officers, and it was in 1983 that was published. And I read even the original study, and what she's saying today is like what we're finding out today, and what she said then, it's like what we're finding out now. And so in a way, it's like not a lot has changed, and that is where my, I don't know what to call it, my grief comes from, to see that the needle has not been moved very far, or it moved forward and then went back. And we want to see consistent moving forward for everybody's benefit, because there is a lot of suffering that is preventable and can be alleviated with a real focus and determination and commitment to staff wellness and other things as well. So let's go to the next slide. There have been some research findings that, of course, support that. It's intuitively obvious that, and I like to use the term like tools, using tools. You cannot build a house, you cannot build a kitchen cabinet if you don't have tools that work right. And the staff are the tools through which the job gets done on the ground, be it custody staff or non-custody staff. And the big deal is like, to me, if I kind of boil it down to self-regulation, can staff manage their own self, their own emotional reactions, their own thinking well enough to be able to manage others and de-escalate and guide others in a constructive way? So there have been some studies, and more than these. I'm just we just listed a few about programs that like wellness programs, mindfulness, um, the- programs that help with the escalation and help people to be supportive. They reduce violence because they prevent violence, and it only makes sense. So at the end of the presentation, we have those references. Like one is from Pennsylvania, one is a NIJ paper, a study. One is from California, where they've a survey found that officers who had been assaulted were or exposed to violence in general were less likely to believe in the possibility of rehabilitation. Therefore, they were less likely to want to invest in it and follow steps toward it. And anything like the more recent study by Hull and Breckler and Jaegers about staff wellness programs that work together with the escalation and supportive practices, reducing um, violence, improving occupational safety, which of course reduces post-traumatic issues, reduces depression, anxiety, substance use. They're all related. And it only makes sense, but does not happen automatically and easily. It takes investing with fervor and focus in order to have any fruit bearing that is worth noting. So I will turn it here to Joe.
Hi, everybody. I hope everybody's doing well this afternoon, or if you're very far to the west, maybe it's still morning. I don't know how much of our audience we get further than California, but um, here's the central question, right? What do we mean that we can't have prison reform without staff wellness? And before we get into the meat of why we believe that's true, we're going to take a look at some common goals or targets of prison reform. When people talk about prison reform, what are we looking for? What are we talking about? Next slide, please. Oh, you already did it. Uh, Basically, here's what we're looking for. We're looking for more humane living conditions for the incarcerated. And that means improved nutrition, improved access to medical and mental health care, appropriate medical and mental health care, increased pro-social behaviors from people that are incarcerated, a reduction of violence within the prison, and less uses of force, to stop things that are going on. We're also looking for reduction in our use of restrictive housing. It's a hot button issue all over the nation. And in every prison system, there is a lot of pressure to reduce that. Also, we want people to leave prison or generally to live in better conditions than when they entered. We want them not in better conditions, but to leave in better condition as opposed to when they entered. We want to rebuild lives and we want to reduce recidivism, right? That's prison reform. And prison reform will benefit families and communities alike. And before we go any further, I just kind of want to throw a statement out there, and it seems counterintuitive, but to some people maybe it does. To others maybe not so much. But as the title of this presentation implies, we believe that the things that we just talked about, each and every one of the points I just made, um, are affected by and in fact dependent on staff wellness. Um, and the opposite of that is also true. Um, if we continue to ignore what I will term, and if you work in prison or you're an administrator, this can't be news. Um, I'll term it just we have an epidemic of staff unwellness in the prisons in America, probably around the world. But as far as we're concerned, here in America, there's just an epidemic of staff unwellness. Effective, lasting, meaningful prison reform is not possible without reversing that epidemic. And if you don't believe that, I firmly believe, that if Katerina and I do pretty well today, I think you're gonna be able to answer those questions in the affirmative if you're on the other side of that right now. And I believe and I hope that after we're done, that you'll become a voice and an advocate for needing staff reform, staff wellness reform, comprehensive evidence-based staff wellness initiatives. So let's get into the meat of our presentation here. Conditions essential for reform, and we're going to focus on the staff, right? So for reform to be even remotely possible, these things must be true. Staff must feel psychologically and physically safe, right? If you've ever heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or even if you haven't, the concept goes something like this. We all have needs. The most basic needs are at the bottom of the pyramid. You can't get off the bottom of the pyramid and climb up to the next level of need until the bottom of the pyramid is met. The bottom of the pyramid is met by food, water, oxygen, physical safety, and I'm going to put psychological safety on the bottom of the pyramid as well. We can't do anything unless staff feel physically safe at work and psychologically safe. Now, if you're not familiar with psychological safety, it can sound complicated, but basically it's the ability of staff to feel comfortable at work, to be able to be themselves, to make decisions, to talk to people, to ask for advice, to make mistakes without being ridiculed, right? To learn, to be able to say, you know what, I'm not well, and not be made to feel like that's a bad thing to say, right? Psychological safety, the ability to trust your coworkers, trust your supervisors. For staff need to perceive that they're trusted by leadership and of leadership, right? And so at the end of the day, if you don't believe that your leadership trusts you to make the appropriate decisions, that's going to impact your confidence and your ability to adequately do your job. At the same time, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later in the presentation, if you don't trust your leadership, that can create conditions that are rife for just problematic prison running. Staff that feel empowered, staff need to feel respected and valued, right? Do staff start to feel like they're just a number? Um, have we heard staff say, you know what, the inmates get treated better than I do? And whether or not that's reality, if staff are feeling that way, as we will talk about, that's going to undermine any effort for meaningful reform. Staff need to feel that like they belong and like they're supported, and not necessarily micromanaged and continuously judged or blamed for problems that are far beyond their control. There has to be meaning just beyond pay and benefits, right? Um, quite frankly, we don't make enough money to do the things we do, but there has to be some meaning to what we do. And the one in the box that's sort of set off from the rest, we need to get rid of this sort of us against them mindset, right? And that's, it's not us versus the incarcerated. It's not line staff versus management. It's not all of that breeds for problematic prisons, right? If line staff and management are on different pages, the prison's not going to run well, right? If staff are constantly pitting themselves against inmates and going in thinking that the inmates are going to do XYZ, that also breeds for poor prison management. We'll talk about a few more conditions we believe are essential for staff reform on the next slide. Staff are actually the main means through which rehabilitation occurs. And what do we mean by that? We can have all kinds of programs and people can read books and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, it's our interactions with the incarcerated individuals that serve as that rehabilitative method. And we're going to drill down on kind of why that is and what that is as we go through this. I'm here to tell you, if you don't already know, the philosophy, do as I say, not as I do, is not an effective way to manage anyone, to run anyone, to lead anyone, right? And so what I mean by that is if staff are unwell, if they're showing up disheveled, if they're continuously angry, upset, they're dressed poorly, they're clearly sleep deprived, they can't even keep their eyes open, right? Who are we to tell inmates, right, that you need to engage in wellness and better yourselves in doing this if our staff aren't even taking care of themselves or being taken care of by the leadership? And so that's a problem. Um, it, if staff aren't well, they're not going to be able to deliver effective care to the inmate population. And whether you believe we're in the business of caring for inmates or not, the fact is we're responsible for their safety and well-being, and we can't do that if we're not well. In fact, I would argue that in order for us to interact effectively with the inmate population, we ourselves need to be emotionally, mentally, and spiritually healthy, at least to some degree. At least we need to mitigate the impact of some of the unhealthy things. We talked about this a little bit. Staff have an impact on the inmates they encounter every single day. And it's those interactions that form the basis, I believe, for meaningful change for the inmate population. Um, we have an opportunity, and I'm sure we're all familiar, or maybe not, but we're familiar with some of the statements by athletes that they are not role models. And we may get some of that from the staff that work with us, right? We are not role models. Um, I got news for you. We are, and they do look to us for the way we treat other people. And treating people with respect and empathy, justice and fairness. Um, I guess I'm going to submit to you. Are you going to reach? I'll just ask a hypothetical. Are you going to reach every inmate if you treat them with respect, empathy, justice, and fairness? Are you going to change everyone's lives? Is every incarcerated individual going to respond positively to that? Unfortunately, that answer is no, right? And we all know that. But let me flip that on its head. If you treat everybody, every incarcerated person, or every coworker even, with disrespect, a lack of empathy, injustice, and blatant unfairness, if you're mean and rude and uncaring, and that's how you go about treating people, are you going to reach anyone? Are you going to positively impact anyone? And some of you may be thinking, maybe not, but some of you may be thinking, or maybe you have staff that think, if you're in a leadership position and you're thinking more about your sort of front interacting staff, that you know what, our mission is to protect the public and the safety and security of the institution. Those are our missions, right? We're gonna, and they are. I think everybody would agree. Those are the overarching missions: protect the public and run safe and secure institutions. Well, then let me pose another hypothetical. If that is your only goal and you don't care about rehabilitation no matter what your agency says, if you treat people with respect, empathy, justice, and fairness, is prison likely to be more or less safe? Are we likely to have more or fewer attacks on staff? Are we likely to have more or less uses of force? Are we likely to have more or less use of restrictive housing, right? And then let's just talk about when they release, protecting the public. I got news for you. Part of protecting the public is making sure we're not releasing people that are more broken than when they came into the system. And so how you treat people while they're incarcerated is part of protecting the public. So that's I apologize. I went off track there just a minute, but it's all part of what we do, right? And staff wellness has just such a tremendous impact. If you're not well, you're not going to do this effectively. And I think we're going to delve into that a little bit on the next slide in some specific ways. Here we are, right? So we're going to talk about this stuff briefly, but really, I want you guys to sort of just think about well staff versus unwell staff for each of these categories, right? Or if that doesn't make sense to you, just think about yourself, right? If you're having a bad day, if you're feeling sad or depressed or anxious or frustrated or angry, um, and you're having a bad period of time, or you're feeling physically unwell, or you're sleep deprived, or you're just exhausted, you've got low energy, low mood, how is that going to impact your professionalism, right? Versus maybe inadvertent or maybe intentional violations of policy, right? As opposed to if you're feeling well and having a good day and you're feeling good about yourself and good about your job and positive about everything, are you more or less likely to violate policy or follow the rules? Are you more or less likely to take shortcuts, right? How many times do we see it? Maybe we've done it ourselves. I know I have, where it's just like, you know what? Heck with it. I'm tired. I'm angry. I'm frustrated. Nobody cares anyway. What difference does it make whether or not I hit the dead pins on the handcuffs? What difference does it make whether or not I actually put the restraints on somebody correctly? Almost nothing ever happens. And if it does, well, I'll handle that and I'll figure it out, right? That stuff is more likely when we're frustrated, when we don't feel well. Self-regulation versus aggravating interactions, right? If we are frustrated and we're angry and we are sleep deprived and we're tired, are we better at keeping our temper in check or maybe not so good? Are we more patient with the incarcerated individuals or our coworkers? Or do we have a tendency to snap at them more often? Do we have a tendency to aggravate the situation rather than calm it down, right? The ability to regulate down the emotions of the incarcerated. And so take it away from ourselves for a minute, right? If we're going to have emotionally charged interactions with incarcerated individuals, right? I'm sorry, but most of them are not incarcerated because they have a track record of making good decisions. And even if they do have a track record of making good decisions, they're probably not real happy about being incarcerated. Who could blame them? So those interactions are going to come. You think about it. If you're feeling like crap, are you going to be better equipped or worse equipped to help bring them down without using force, right? Which should be our goal for lots of reasons. So the ability to de-escalate versus, I'm feeling angry and my temper is on the edge too because I got mandated 4 times this week and And that, that was before I picked up an optional overtime on day one of my work week, right? And so now I'm running on 3.5 hours of sleep a night for Lord knows how long. Are you more or less likely to effectively be able to de-escalate a situation? Or is it more likely to go the other way? Right. And so what we're talking about here is well staff are more likely to operate safely. Unwell staff are more likely to be indifferent, impatient, impulsive, and aggressive, which creates kind of a cycle of violence, right? If we're angry and irritable, and the incarcerated are angry and irritable, that's a recipe for disaster, but it's also self perpetuating because they lash out at us. We don't have the self restraint. We lash back out at them. We put them in restrictive housing. Now they're blaming us. Now we got to put a team together and we've got to do a calculated use of force to go get them. And Lord knows who gets hurt in those interactions. But did anybody come out of that feeling better physically or mentally? No, it's self-perpetuating, right? And this notion of retaliation that just keeps the cycle going. And I know we've all got stories where inmates have retaliated against staff members, but guess what? We probably all have stories about staff members retaliating against inmates. And I would submit to you that we're a lot less likely to take that approach if we're physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually well. That's the impact of staff wellness. And we'll move on. Some other consequences, right? This is just it's just it's just common sense, right? If you're tired, if you're sleep deprived, if you're angry, frustrated, you're going to forget things. On a biological or physiological level, those emotions and those things erode the ability of the frontal lobe to make decisions, to remember things, right? Um, there's a whole, we did a webinar on sleep a few months back. If you haven't looked at that, I encourage you, find it on our YouTube channel and check it out. It is amazing the number of areas that chronic partial sleep deprivation, so consistently depriving people of the necessary 7 to 9 hours of sleep, what that does to people. And not the least of which is falling asleep in a job where that's probably not the best way to go about things. And so what we see is this whole thing, this unhealthy, and we have the term self-perpetuating downward spiral, and I just don't know how to describe it any better than that, right? We when we're feeling unwell, when we are unwell, we don't have the appropriate coping behaviors to help us navigate this stuff. And that can affect our workforce culture. It affects our relationships with staff. It affects the way we interact with each other, whether or not we trust each other, we rely on each other, we snap at each other. And that can make for a pretty miserable prison day. And if we're treating incarcerated individuals that way, it can make for um, an entirely poor day for the entire institution. But does another rhetorical question, do any of us really believe that if we have one of those really bad days in prison, that we don't bring any of that home? That we don't bring these emotions and these feelings and our frustrations? Do we really believe we don't bring them home? And even if you come home and lock yourself in a room so nobody interacts with you, guess what? Your absence is still bringing that home. And what does that do to your family life? Right? And so if your work life is suffering and that impacts your family life, and you can't figure that piece out, and then your family life starts to go downhill, whether or not it's because you're frustrated, you're angry, or you're just exhausted, you just can't literally do anything, right? And if your family life is falling apart, what's that going to do to your work life the next day? And so this thing just sort of builds on each other, and it happens sometimes slowly and over time. Other times it happens quite quickly, but it really just creates this downward spiral. It's like a negative reinforcement loop where it can get worse and worse and worse. And on the back half of the presentation today, hopefully we're going to talk about kind of steps to go a different direction. All right. Before we get to that portion, let's just bring it home with some, we talk about staff unwellness, and I've used the words emotionally, psychologically, right, and things like that, unwell. But let's just talk about mental disorder rates, and these are probable rates, and so these are kind of aggregated across a couple of studies, and I think, and Katerina will jump in and if I'm incorrect here, but I believe these are primarily based on symptom self-reports, right? And so questionnaires where staff are reporting these symptoms. And so take that with a grain of salt, but we're seeing symptoms consistent with, and I'm not going to read all those numbers, the slides up there, you guys can all see them, right? PTSD, depression, and then the comorbidity of the both of them. The numbers are huge. One of the ones that really stands out is a disorder we don't talk about a lot is generalized anxiety disorder. Look at the upper level of that. 60% suffering from general or pervasive anxiety across situations and environments. That's huge. Alcohol use disorder. This probably is going to come as a huge surprise to absolutely nobody on this webinar. Corrections has an alcohol problem. And I think that 26% is absolutely an underestimate, right? That's just the people that are willing to admit that maybe they have a little bit of an issue. I, and alcohol use disorder unfortunately complicates every other disorder on this list, and it serves as a huge negative impact. Sleep disorders is another one, and these numbers 45 to 60%. And again, these are people that admit it, right? And this is a population, as I jokingly said, I remember my father, who was a firefighter, saying, right, he was a firefighter who also worked four other side jobs, depending on what month it was, right? I'll get all the sleep I need when I'm dead. Yeah, unfortunately, that's not how this works, right? And so I really encourage you to do some research on sleep and then think about what our staff are going through if they're consistently not being permitted. Let's face it, you double somebody once, that's a minimum of 16 hours. We haven't figured out a commute. Most of us don't live right next door to the prison, so we add on a sizable commute. You're probably going to want to take a shower at some point when you get home. Maybe you're going to want to get some food. And that leaves you with how much time to interact with your family. And even if you only spend an hour with your family, you're left with what, 3 to 4 hours to sleep before you got to get up and try again? Doing that once, the research tells us doing that once significantly impairs your decision making and your ability to function.
Yeah.
Once.
Yeah. Joan,
Once.
I'll jump in here, like we talked about before. Like, I wanted you to not miss the fact, our audience not to miss the fact that we have people with insomnia. A lot of the sleep disorders are really
Mhm.
primarily related to insomnia. So even when you put your head down on the pillow and you're ready to go to sleep, you can't, because so revved up, you've had those energy drinks, maybe an altercation with somebody, an assault, whatever, a clash with your supervisor, and you just can't go to sleep even when you have the time, those few precious hours, and they are like staring at the ceiling, waking up getting out of bed more exhausted than when they got into bed, and then having to go back in and do it all over again and be expected to be impeccable in your delivery of professional services.
Yeah, well said. Well said. And, and we'll talk a little bit, just a little bit about some of the mandatory overtime and stuff like that towards the end here, and I'm sure it'll come up in the question and answer at the end. But let's not forget the stuff at the bottom of the slide too. And corrections has a couple of other epidemics in addition to alcohol use and staff unwellness. We have a suicide epidemic among correction staff, and that is the unfortunate but absolute truth. We're talking about 1 in 9 people experiencing suicidal thoughts. That is a huge number. When you consider there are 120 people logged into this webinar right now, presumably most of us are corrections professionals in some way, shape, or form, right? That is 10 or more people on this webinar right now that have struggled with suicidal thoughts at some point. That's a huge number. It's much bigger than the general population. And like everything we've got up here, it's higher than the rate encountered by other first responders, right? And so we've got a problem. And the risk of death by suicide, the risk is increased almost 40%, maybe more, depending on which studies you look at. But that's the risk of death by suicide. And there's a lot of things that go into that. But staff wellness has a ton of impacts on us personally and our families too. And so now that we've talked about and put names to some of the disorders, the next slide we're going to talk about kind of the nuts and bolts, because as mental health professionals, right, we don't treat diagnostic labels, right? I know everybody wants to think, oh, that person's diagnosed with, dissociative identity disorder. We're going to treat that diagnostic label. No, what we actually do, we treat symptoms, right? And so, what are we talking about when we put those disorders up there? These are the symptoms that we're talking about that are seen most often or more often. Things like hypervigilance, right? That constant scanning for danger, and that is at work and then it bleeds over into at home, right? Constantly looking for the exit, constantly evaluating threats. Although I will tell you that some prison employees that have been exposed to traumas go the other direction. And their threat detector just goes down completely when they're not in prison. Because if I survive prison, I don't have to have a threat detector in the community, which is an interesting response. Restlessness, agitation, irritability, and anger outbursts, right? I wish we could do little polls in the chat room, right? Are anybody in here less likely to lose their temper than before they started working in prisons? Right. I see some snickers among the faces, the few faces I can see, but right. Exaggerated startle response. And that those are some fancy words, but what that means is there are triggers that just set us off, right? Everybody jumps when there's a loud noise. Not everybody jumps like we do when we pair a loud noise with a gunshot, that maybe the shot went over our heads as we were responding to an incident on the yard that day, right? If you work in a system or you're a first responder to emergencies, right? And you're tuned, right? You're honed in on that radio because people's lives depend on it. And you have a radio call, right? But it's your weekend. It's your Tuesday. You're not working today, and you actually have a chance to go to the grocery store with your spouse, and you hear customer needs assistance on aisle 4, right? And before you know it, you've knocked over 3 people with shopping carts, because just the fact of somebody calling for assistance kicks you into another gear, right? You're responding. Your fight or flight kicks in. Or maybe sometimes corrections people go the other way. They start to feel like it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter, and there's nothing I can do about it, and I'm not making a difference. Hell, maybe it's me. Maybe I'm the one who sucks, right? They blame themselves, or they just get pervasive about blaming leadership, right? Everything's leadership's fault. It's their fault I don't have this to do that. It's their fault this. And that can go different ways. We see persistent low mood, right? People that just they lost that spark. They lost that energy, right? They're sort of turning shades of gray where they used to be more colorful in their interactions with family and on the outside, right? Maybe they're preoccupied. Maybe they're anxious. Maybe they've got lots of stuff. The thoughts of death or suicide we talked about, that's real. I'm sorry. This whole notion that talking about suicide does not increase the risk for suicide. Um, okay, there's some truth to that. When you ask somebody about suicidality, it does not necessarily increase the risk of their suicidality. But I believe the constant exposure to suicide affects us. I mean, let's face it, for suicide to be an option, suicide has to be an option, right? We have to be exposed to it. And we're exposed to it a lot. And it's usually in the context of suicide of the incarcerated individuals, right? And so it's a complicated phenomenon, but thoughts of death or suicide are commonly experienced, excessive and uncontrolled worry. And people don't like to admit this one, right? And maybe, just maybe, some of our anger outbursts and some of our frustration is actually worry that we're masking, right? And I'm not gonna throw gender in there, but I think men have a very pronounced tendency to not display or admit to worry or anxiety because we have two emotions. We're either happy or we're pissed off. So we get angry. And I believe Dr. Spinaris has her hand raised.
Thank you for making a little light out of this heavy section. And I was thinking all those symptoms we have up here are what I've called corrections fatigue, or part of it anyway. And that's when people what people encounter when they enter into a facility. They encounter that atmosphere, what we call toxic cultures, where people backstab each other. There's no psychological safety when people don't support and help each other. And I'm talking staff here, and where there's that negativity, that constant negativity, like a friend of ours told us, where he walked with somebody from one facility to another, and he said, "Oh my goodness, look at those nice flowers," and the other person responded, "They die in the winter." That was his response. They die in the winter. And so there's a constant drain of negativity. So that's one point that I want to mention. And the other point is that when suicide happens so much and people are around it so much, or attempts, it becomes more normalized as an acceptable response to misery, suffering, and when things don't go the way we like. So it becomes much more, kind of moves up the list as a likely option, as opposed to somebody who barely ever hears about suicide, and they would reject it outright, like absolutely not. And somebody put in the chat about suicide contagion. Yep, absolutely. That was a good use of the term. Thanks, Joe.
And thank you for bringing up that stuff. And that's exactly what I meant for suicide to be an option. It has to be an option. Um, and I've talked to family members about it and just informal polling. And it's amazing, right? Suicide is just not a common option for most people. So that is real. And so we're going to go to the next slide and talk about some other symptoms. Intrusive traumatic memories and flashbacks, and typically nightmares. These are in response to kind of more significant traumatic incidents. Although the nightmares can be related to sort of this. There's an idea that PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, used to be conceptualized as sort of exposure to one big life-threatening trauma, usually, and then the symptoms result from that. But there is thankfully, a growing recognition in the field of this idea that chronic exposure to lesser traumas also result in some of the very same symptoms, right? And nightmares are more common in those situations necessarily than the flashbacks, right? Because it's just the stuff that keeps coming back and gnawing at your consciousness. Difficulty concentrating and remembering and deciding. I talked about that briefly before in the context of sleep deprivation, but negative emotional states also result in difficulties in all of those areas. And we've talked about all the rest of this stuff, except for maybe avoidance of traumatic reminders. Um, Once you're exposed to a trauma, there can be some very powerful connections to that traumatic event. And some of the most powerful ones are sound, smells, and tastes, especially smells and tastes. And so it's interesting that there are things that inadvertently get connected to your trauma that can come back and cause you to avoid a whole host of things, and avoiding social interaction and help. This last one on the list, we really haven't talked about at all. And um, it's amazing to me that as a mental health professional working in corrections, that I don't believe I had heard the term moral injury until probably 8 months ago. And that's significant. So what do I mean by moral injury? So I try not to read, I try to engage, but I'm going to read a definition of moral injury just because I want to make sure I get it right. And then I just want to talk just for a couple of minutes about some implications, and then it'll come back into play here in a minute. But moral injury is the psychological and spiritual harm resulting from a betrayal of one's moral code through acts of commission, in other words, you doing something, Um, or omission, in other words, failing to do something right or failing to stop someone else from doing something wrong. I'm sorry, failing to do something right or failing to stop somebody else from doing something wrong, um, or witnessing acts that transgress one's values, right? So we're talking about not little things, not I didn't put the keyways in the right direction or I didn't lock the dead pins, but we're talking about significant events that are so contrary to our moral fiber that they have a profound impact. And when this stuff happens, um, it results in this kind of, it can result, doesn't always, can result in sort of a pervasive sense of guilt, of shame, of anger, maybe self-hatred, depending on this notion of spiritual harm. If it was contrary to your spiritual beliefs, it can lead to social withdrawal, self-harm, and research tells us that incidences of moral injury are linked to suicidal risk. There is a very significant risk uh, that is associated with moral injury related to suicide concerns. And where does this stuff come from inside of corrections, right? What are the sources of moral injury in corrections? And so, after doing some thinking and doing a little bit of research, I found some kind of common sources, and one of them is this concept of betrayal, right? So the relationship between betrayal and moral injury. So betrayal by supervisors or colleagues, or maybe even the institution itself. So remember I said acts of omission, right? So maybe this isn't something that you actively did, but being in an environment where leadership or the agency doesn't give you the resources you need to prevent these serious harms, doesn't give you the resources to do what you believe is necessary and right. And that can lead to some deep-seated sense of betrayal because your moral code is telling you you need to do this, but you're not being able to because of these constraints put on you by leadership, inadequate resources that prevents you from doing stuff, witnessing or participating in acts of physical harm against other people, right? That's all part of this institutional pressure to do unethical things. And even if it's not institutional pressure, how about just good old-fashioned peer pressure to do inappropriate things, to engage in inappropriate retaliatory behaviors, whether that's physical or whether that's other than physical, right? All of that stuff, if that stuff goes against your moral code, you're at risk of suffering a moral injury, and that has profound negative implications. Um, Katerina, anything else you want to say about moral injury at this point?
Yeah, because I've been astounded about the degree of it. And I remember before we even started Desert Waters Correctional Outreach, when I was practicing part-time psychotherapy in Canyon City, Colorado, I heard about it from people coming into my office and talking about it and how they felt the grief, the lostness, like you said, the self-hate, the helplessness, and other people quitting because of such a thing, and the pressure that they had from others to keep their mouth shut and cooperate with the program, like falsify a document, whatever it might be, or else they would be in trouble, and they would be seriously in trouble. I mean, very seriously in trouble. There would be a lot of issues to contend with that they were afraid about. And I also heard it from medical personnel where they felt they didn't have the resources to take care of somebody appropriately, and they felt helpless, like they were violating their Hippocratic oath in a way. And it was these are hard things, and that's where people end up sometimes doing something because of the pressure, and then feeling that what they did is unforgivable, and that's where the suicide risk comes in, like I'm going to be my own judge, jury, and executioner, and I'm going to take myself out because I don't deserve to be alive because of what I've done. And it's heartrending, and people usually battle those battles all by themselves. Nobody's in their head with them to walk them through it and to help them. And sometimes some of that is warranted and some of it is unwarranted. And they can both be very destructive. But we never really talk about it much, except for maybe more lately, because again, it's been in our blind spot because one has to first acknowledge that these things happen. And then, of course, talk about their impact. But we have to acknowledge, first of all, that they do happen. And when you have people under pressure where they feel their life is in danger, they sometimes resort to things that are not the best by any stretch. They're horrid. And then you have all the repercussions downstream. So that's why we keep saying we cannot have prison reform or even well run prisons without staff being well. Thank you, Joe.
Well said. Okay. And with that, we're going to kind of move on. Okay. The point of all this, talking about those probable rates of mental disorders, talking about the symptoms that we've seen, and there are countless other negative symptoms or indicators of staff unwellness that we see. The bottom line is that those symptoms inevitably impair staff functioning. You may think you're Superman, and despite those symptoms, you can just carry on as normal. I would argue you're a person suffering from poor insight. That's just not true. Okay, as strong as we are, these necessarily impact our functioning. And I know we're taught that we don't admit weaknesses. Well, I would submit to you it takes a heck of a lot more strength and courage to admit you're struggling than it does to pretend you're okay. And so these symptoms do impair our functioning, and Katerina put a line in there: you cannot pour from an empty cup. And at the end of the day, if if we're the ones that are supposed to be doing the good work and doing the work protecting society and running safe and secure prisons and rehabilitating incarcerated individuals, if we can't take care of ourselves, we are very unlikely to be able to take care of anyone else. And that's just the bottom line. And I think this is where I want to just talk about, and I'm very cognizant of our time because there's so much we could talk about, but I want to delve into one issue real quick. And a lot of people have thought that, well, you know, pay increases and incentive pay and retention pay, that's going to solve all of our problems. That's going to improve staff morale, and it's going to increase recruiting, and it's going to increase retention, and it's going to do all this wonderful stuff. Well, I guess the good news is that that stuff, it's not bad in the short term. We hire more people. Um, People are initially happy. They get a bigger paycheck. Um, what we've seen time and time again is that although there are some short-term benefits to that stuff, they do little, if anything, to look at long-term staff wellness, right? Things eventually go back to the way they were. People get frustrated, people get angry, people don't feel like they're valuable, people start quitting again, overtime starts happening again, and this whole thing starts over again. And Katerina put one quote on here: "You can't pour from an empty cup." Well, there was one she had sent to me a few months back that I think sums up, the way I feel about this stuff, about pay raises and stuff. Don't get me wrong; I'm all for paying corrections professionals more. Absolutely, as a rule, we need to pay corrections professionals more, but it's not going to solve our problems. And I think, what was the quote, Katerina? It was, "You can't pay me enough to keep walking on a broken leg."
Right.
I believe it was something
That's
like
what it
that.
was. Yeah. After a
And
while, the pain is too overwhelming. Go ahead.
yeah, there it is, right? Money isn't going to solve all of this stuff. And I can all but guarantee you, if we don't prioritize staff wellness, your any efforts at prison reform are going to fail. It is what it is. So this may seem repetitive, but I don't know how to say it any better. Any effort at reform has to address the needs of incarcerated people and the needs of staff. And to neglect either one of those is going to backfire.
Yep, absolutely. And that's what we are shouting from the housetops and the internet across the globe. Like, we need to wake up and realize that it's like, again, running a vehicle with the engine impaired. Like, you're not going to get very far with the engine failing. So, like, what are our next steps? Where do we go? And I was thinking, if people really grasp this, if they really, really, really get it, they would make staff wellness such a indisputable priority. And again, there is this feedback loop that healthier staff will improve the work environment, and the work environment will affect them positively, and it's a positive feedback loop, or will continue in a negative feedback loop. But really, prison advocates should be pouring their money into staff wellness. They should be pouring the millions into staff wellness, because that is the golden key, in my opinion, to getting a humane environment. If staff feel themselves that they're not being humanely treated, most of them, some of them may kind of rise above that and cope, but most people will not, in the long run, will not continue treating others humanely. Like Joe had said something very profound to me the other day, actually a few months ago, about what would happen if there was a requirement that, or a mandate at prisons not to let the incarcerated people sleep more than 3 or 4 hours a day. What would happen if we wouldn't let them sleep longer? What would people act like? But we take it in stride about the staff being on 2 to 4 hours of sleep for months and years at a time. Like, people break down. People go to sleep and don't wake up. I'm sure you heard the people run to the emergency and drop because of the cardiovascular consequences of sleep deprivation and forgetting stuff and losing it with somebody, whatever, all that stuff. So really, if we really got it, we would be pouring our efforts into staff wellness, not to coddle them, but to make the place more effective. And so what do we need for long term? Because we have seen the flashes in the pan, I'm sure you have too, until the dust settles a little bit, and then we forget and move on and expect things to run automatically. And it's one of those things that you cannot just set it one time and let it run by itself. You have to keep feeding it. It's like you don't gas up one time at the gas station. You have to periodically fill your tank with gas. And the same thing with staff wellness. You have to do it on a very consistent basis. And yes, it's going to be time, energy, and money. It's going to be expensive. But the alternative is incredible suffering for people on both sides of the bars, generation after generation after generation. And it's beyond grievous. So we need to acknowledge that we cannot run a show with broken down people, and then advocate for staff wellness, and advocate at a very serious level all the way to the legislators, decision makers, come up with new statutes, policies, and invest. We cannot do it just on good with good intentions. We cannot just run on good intentions. It has to be biting the proverbial bullet, like Norway did in the 50s, 1950s, and then again in the 1990s. And they're still struggling, but they're doing way better than we are. Way, 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 way better in terms of preserving people's humanity on both sides of the fence or the bars. And having policies that line up and programs that really deliver. And they're not just somebody's pet project or flavor of the month that will go away with the next administration, and that is based on some facts and evidence. And then the whole thing of educating people and giving them the capacity, the resources, what it takes. The more I studied about sleep deprivation, the more horrified I got. It's like taking somebody's oxygen away from them and expect them to keep walking, or expect them to keep functioning dehydrated. We need sleep. I mean, our brain, let me give you a mini piece of information here. Our brain flushes out toxins and byproducts of use, debris, through our sleep. If you don't get enough sleep, you cannot flush out all those byproducts and debris. So it keeps accumulating in your brain, impairing your thinking and your emotional control and everything else in between, inflammation, etc. So it's like unreal to me that we so flippantly think that just throwing at people overtime pay will be enough. Like, no, 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 no. So, and then we expect them to function well, and when they don't, woe's them. They are in trouble. And yes, they have to take responsibility, but what kind of shape are they in? What kind of shape are they in? And would you do that to your child? Would you do that to your child and expect them to function well? So can we have the next slide, please? And we talk about all components, and we have presented this slide before, that we need everybody on board, every stakeholder, including the family members of both the staff and the incarcerated population. We need everybody on board. We need to have the bottom up stuff, like the staff taking responsibility for themselves. Nobody's going to come to your house and say, put this 12th drink down or whatever. You have to make choices. And then it's like top down. What do administrators, how do they set the pace? What do they do? What do the supervisor do? Are they supportive, or do they say, hey, I went through it and coped, so get over it. That's what we pay you to do. And don't bother me, figure it out. So we need the top down support, the administrators or decision makers going to knock on doors of like legislators, et cetera, and saying, we need this, otherwise we cannot perform, we cannot execute the mission. And how do we treat each other? The staff treating each other. A lot of times we have heard it's not the inmates, it's the staff. I mean, I can't tell you how many hundreds of times I've heard that. 75 to 95% of my stress comes from other staff. And this is avoidable, preventable. It's not like we're not stuck with it. And we cannot keep doing it and expecting different results. So we have to support all parts of the system, and also everybody engage and commit, and realize that we have a very high level mission to fulfill. I mean, we're talking again generations of people. The whole issue of how do you deal with crime? What do you do when people hurt, somebody else in society? What do you do with laws about that? These are huge responsibilities. And then having power over a human being, telling them when to go to bed, when to wake up, what to eat, where to eat it, how to dress. These are huge, huge responsibilities. And we put them in the hands of people that are barely keeping it together themselves. And it's not going to work. It's not working right now. And just to go to the next slide, one way we have tried to address that is through the safety net accreditation program, where we put together, after a ton of work, 18 standards that are as evidence informed as feasible at the time, and trying to be comprehensive and holistic, because I've seen so many little bits and pieces all over the place that are done kind of like all over, and there's no consistency, there is no goal, there is no target, there is no, this is where we're going, this is how we're going to keep it up, this is how we're going to add to it over time and build. We need a system. We need to take it seriously, not just, oh, well, oh, yeah, check the box of staff wellness because we have once a year or once a month, we have a, I don't know, pizza party. Well, this is not a wellness program. Sorry. Or bags of candy. No, sorry. These are not wellness programs. Um, so having some kind of accountability and outcomes evaluation, and then the national thing of accreditation and raising the bar. We need to raise the bar. We're talking about people's lives, and like I said, generationally, their children, their grandchildren, their parents. I mean, on both sides of the bars, because talk to some CO's kids, see what they'll tell you. Um, see what they'll tell you. So back to you, Joe.
All right. So one of the paths forward, right, is a better informed workforce, and we're talking about evidence informed training. Unfortunately, there's just not a whole lot of research out there. We would love to have a bar, right, that tells us exactly what we need to do with our prisons. Unfortunately, all we can do is sort of pull from best practices, right? We know that this type of training impacts this area, and this type of training impacts this area, and so that's kind of what Katerina was talking about, is making sure that any staff training or staff wellness program incorporates multiple dimensions, multiple areas, each of which has some evidence base to it, right? So we're not just, oh, I saw on YouTube or whatever, TikTok, that people had a staff wellness event where, they were doing the whole, they put a guy in a red man costume, which is a big padded suit, and then they beat him with foam hammers. Right. And okay. And so maybe then you saw that, and people were standing around laughing. And so people think maybe that's a component of staff wellness. And look at all the people laughing. And so they get together and they do that without really thinking through what they're doing. And so we try to stick with evidence-informed staff training. I will tell you, you're not going to find any research evidence that tells you that getting a bunch of first responders together and beating some other first responder who's wearing a costume is going to result in staff wellness. So we're talking about things like developing emotional intelligence skills. And if anybody reads, I hope you do, the Correctional Oasis newsletter, Dr. Spinera's put together a great article, and I don't remember if it was which episode it was, but she talks about, right, how much money we pour into firearms training and practice, and we need that, right? That's very important in self-defense, of course. But how much money are we putting into regulating our own emotions and teaching us how to better emotionally interact and connect with other people? And that's a skill I'm hoping that we all use every day. And if we're not using it, maybe we should. And there are supervisory issues related to your supervisory style and using emotional intelligence or EQ skills, or developing a leadership style that is relational in nature. And there is some evidence and some research out there that shows that that type of leadership style actually can mitigate some of the negative reactions of the staff that work for you. And so that's why that stuff is important. But again, evidence informed, self-regulation and resilience promoting skills, right? I think to a certain extent, there's a lot of the things we do and we go through in corrections that are unavoidable. Things are going to happen. Violence is going to happen. But having skills on the front end that are well known and well practiced so that they can be employed almost via muscle memory, if you will, right? You practice self-defense. Do you practice the other stuff? Do you practice how to bring your emotions under control? Do you have a skill set, right? You can go to a nutritionist and talk about a plan for how to eat. You can go to a physical trainer and have them put you a physical wellness plan that involves running and lifting and all this other stuff, flexibility. Are we doing the same thing with the way we interact and relate to people, or the way we regulate our own emotions, right? Team or trauma responsive training, again, teaching resiliency and some of that stuff is unavoidable. We're going to have to do it. Team building is, of course, essential. We're all supposed to be on the same team, even if we don't act like it at times. Um, Ethics and professional boundaries. And we're talking, excuse me, real and meaningful training, talking about especially decision making in morally high risk situations, right? This is what we do. On a day in, day out basis. There are trainings, there are models out there. It is beyond the scope of our presentation today to go deeply into them, but in a nutshell, research has shown that training that incorporates an ethical framework with critical decision skills and uses them in real-time live scenarios can effectively improve ethical decision making in morally high risk situations. So you use AI, use your internet, find some resources, make sure it's evidence supported. If there's not at least one or two, articles that are scholarly and peer reviewed that are sort of supporting this stuff, think twice about using it. Addressing challenges related to moral injury. And we talked about moral injury quite a bit. What are we talking about in terms of training? Training our supervisors and our line staff to recognize the signs of moral injury in others, right? So learn when somebody is exhibiting signs or maybe exhibiting signs of a moral injury, and talk to that person, how to start that conversation, how to talk to them, how to refer them for assistance if that's what they need, and things of that nature. The other part of it is how to ensure, if you're a supervisor or you're in an administrative leadership role, how to ensure that you're not inadvertently engaging in the types of actions, words, and behaviors that may result in your people believing they were betrayed, and being open enough to hear from your people that they may have been betrayed by something you said or did. That's all part of it, right? Being open enough to listen to that. Maybe there's something to what they say and believe. Maybe it's about other stuff, but at least being open. So the training related to identifying and mitigating moral injury, and then when you see someone who's really struggling with a true moral injury, right? Get that person a professional referral and encourage them, caringly encourage them to get some actual help.
And one
Next
thing I
slide.
want to
Oh, go
throw
ahead.
out about that is that sometimes it's very unwarranted. People feel responsible for absolutely no good reason. Like an example would be you have your best buddy who's called, I don't know, Jim, and one day you have an appointment, you have to take your kid to a doctor's appointment that you waited for months to get in for, and that day you're not at work, and that day Jim gets assaulted, and you beat yourself up and you say, if only I'd been there, Jim, I would have helped Jim out, he would not have been assaulted and end up with a traumatic brain injury or worse. And so that the person may end up beating themselves up and then castigating themselves and feeling like they violated their own principles and values, but they did not. I mean, they couldn't. There was it was not their responsibility to be there that day. They had to do what they had to do with their child, and it was out of their control. So one can talk to somebody and kind of bring them down from that wrong way of thinking that can get them really, really, really distressed and distraught and self-destructive.
Well said. Yeah. Yeah. The irrational moral injuries. Um, some other resources. We're going to hit this stuff real quick because I want to try to leave at least a few minutes for questions and kind of go through there. But policies that support staff wellness that are comprehensive and that hit all those dimensions Katerina was talking about. And I'm not talking about a policy that says that supervisors will incorporate staff wellness into their weekly or monthly staff meetings. Like I'm sorry that it may be well intended, but it has to be comprehensive and not just words, and things of that nature. It- you know, Prisons are overcrowded. It's a bottom line, right? And this is an example of something that we can't do ourselves, right? As a society, we have to be careful about incarcerating our way out of social problems because prison overcrowding is never going to go away unless we get some help there. And reducing mandatory overtime. Listen, we could do a whole 90-minute question and answer on reducing mandatory overtime, and it has to do with staffing and numbers. There's some really innovative things out there. There are some really innovative ideas for how to reduce staffing deficits, improve staff wellness, and all of that gets together. My bet is if we improve staff wellness, recruitment will improve, retention will stay, overtime will go down, and people's willingness to keep working will go up. So we will see that. Happy to address questions in the aftermath. Food options and exercise availability stuff at work. Support for family members. It's neglected all the time. This stuff doesn't just impact those of us who work behind the wall. It touches our families. And as I alluded to before, if the families are going sideways, that impacts how we work, which impacts how the family goes, which impacts how we work, right? Getting those family members the support and sort of the realistic look at what we do. Healthcare for active and retired staff. Oh, I would also say support for retired staff. Like corrections agencies, we try to take care of each other and call each other our family. Okay, great. We mean well, but what about when people retire? Like after 2 weeks, most of the time it's like, oh, well, I guess our family member is no longer our family member. So paying attention and providing wraparound services and engaging with retirees. Believe it or not, suicide risk actually seems to go up among corrections retirees compared to active duty uh, corrections workers. So just something to keep in mind. There's some really innovative stuff out there going on in some state and local systems where they have hired mental health professionals that are dedicated to the actual staff. They don't deal with inmate problems. They don't deal with incarcerated individuals' issues, which that's important. And we hire people to do that. But why aren't we hiring people to take care of our own staff? Because I'm going to tell you what, unless you have a culturally competent counselor or mental health provider. And culturally competent, I mean somebody who understands what we do, right? It's going to be much harder to receive the help. It's not impossible. You don't have to have done it, but you have to understand it, I believe, to effectively intervene. And well trained peer support teams, right? And what I mean by well trained peer support teams, yes, they need critical incident training and they need that stuff. They also need training on how to deal with everyday issues that add up that maybe aren't necessarily a critical incident. And so well-trained, well-rounded peer support teams. And just to kind of to bring it to a close, I hope we've made this point. Listen, staff wellness is not in competition with the well-being of incarcerated people. It's just not. Staff wellness will breed safer facilities, and it's necessary for any lasting and meaningful prison reform. I can't say it enough times, and I'm with Katerina. People that are advocating for prison reform need to turn their attention to this topic. Um, I'll just read that last statement. Strategic prison reform requires vigorous and resolute pursuit of improved working conditions for staff. It, Folks, it's time to put our money where our mouth is and put our resources where they're needed. There it is. Here at Desert Waters, we do have a commitment to developing practical ways and not just ideas. We talked a lot about ideas and we gave a few practical ideas, but our trainings incorporate actual things you can do to enhance staff wellness on a regular basis. And we want to create environments where people aren't just getting through it. They're not just surviving, but they're actually thriving, right? That's the goal. And I think that's the golden path to reducing mandatory overtime, improving retention, reducing this turnover. And we're invested in advancing attainable, sustainable, and impactful prison reform through system-wide staff wellness. We're not just targeting individuals; we're targeting systems, which impacts individuals. We've got a couple of resources. If you go through and if you watch the YouTube video, you can hit pause if you're really interested in drilling down. Use the AI engine of your choice, be it ChatGPT, Perplexity, whatever you want to do. There's some stuff out there. You can go to the next page of resources. A thank you to Dr. Spinaris for pulling all the resources together that we used, and all of these articles are supporting the ideas that we have put forth today. And so this isn't just stuff that the Desert Waters team sat around and made up. This is all stuff that is pulled together from the literature. We are an evidence-informed provider of training. And I think that brings us to a close.
Yes, thank you, Joe. Thank you, Katerina and Joe, for all that information. I'd like to thank you for attending today's Desert Waters for Educational presentation. We are going to have questions after I stop the recording. We have a couple questions in the chat, and then we would invite you to unmute yourself and ask questions once the recording is stopped. However, I would like to take a minute to invite you to the next webinars coming up. On October 16th, we'll do the Staff Strong series looking at the Correctional Family Wellness course, information about that. And that'll be October 16th at 1 p.m. Eastern. And then October 30th, we will have the webinar entitled Embedding Staff Wellness and Corrections, Building Cultures That Care. And that'll be October 30th, again, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Note the time change, 1 p.m. Eastern Time next month.